Clayton Graves built his life one fence post at a time, but it only took one man in a silver coat to burn it all down. Now the builder's gone, and what's left is a rider with nothing to lose but a loaded rifle. The sun peeked over the horizon, painting the dusty plains in hues of orange and gold. Clayton Graves was already awake, his calloused hands milking Bess, the old cow who'd seen better days. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and damp earth. 20 years he'd been on this land, transforming it from a barren patch into a thriving ranch. His son Billy still slept soundly in the small house. Clayton smiled, thinking of the boy's mischievous grin and boundless energy. Billy was his everything since Martha, his wife, passed from a fever 10 years gone. Clayton's ranch house was simple but sturdy, built with his own two hands, a testament to his hard work. The barn stood proudly beside it, filled with hay and the comforting sounds of animals. Fields of wheat swayed gently in the breeze, a golden ocean promising a good harvest. He surveyed his land, a sense of contentment washing over him. This was his sanctuary, his legacy. A far cry from the life he'd once known, a life filled with darkness and violence. He'd traded his guns for a plow, his anger for patience. The townsfolk of Redemption respected Clayton. They knew him as a man of his word, a neighbor who always lent a helping hand. They'd watched him grow old gracefully, his hair turning silver, his eyes crinkling at the corners from years of sun and smiles. They knew little of the man he used to be. He liked it that way. As he carried the bucket of milk towards the house, a blackbird landed on the fence post, its beady eyes watching him. Clayton felt a sudden unease, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. The blackbird's call was harsh, almost like a warning. He dismissed it as his old bones acting up. Still, the feeling lingered, a subtle shadow on his peaceful morning. He looked back at the horizon, wondering if the coming days would be as kind as the dawn. The milk felt heavy in Clayton's hands as he walked toward the house. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. It wasn't just the blackbird, it was the air itself, thick with an unspoken dread. Later that morning, after Billy had eaten his fill of flapjacks, Clayton went to check on the horses. Samson, his trusty steed, seemed restless, pawing at the ground and whinnying nervously. Clayton ran a hand down Samson's neck, trying to soothe him. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "What's got you so riled up?" He noticed a strange discoloration on Samson's flank, a patch of skin that looked almost bruised. He examined it closely but couldn't find any sign of injury. It was just there, a dark mark on his otherwise healthy horse. That night Clayton had a dream. He was standing in his wheat fields, but the golden stalks were withered and black. The sky was a swirling vortex of dust, and the air was filled with the sound of mournful cries. He saw Martha, her face pale and gaunt, reaching out to him with empty hands. He tried to call out to her, but no sound came from his throat. He woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The dream felt too real, too vivid. He got out of bed and went to the window, staring out at the moonlit landscape. Everything seemed peaceful, but the unease lingered, a knot in the pit of his stomach. He knew in his heart that something bad was coming. Something that would shatter the peace he had worked so hard to build. He just didn't know what or when. All he could do was wait and prepare, hoping he was wrong but fearing that he wasn't. He checked the rifle he kept under his bed, the cold steel a small comfort in the face of the unknown. He whispered a prayer for Billy and for the strength to face whatever lay ahead. The stranger rode into Redemption just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty street. He sat tall in the saddle, his silver coat gleaming in the fading light. It was an expensive coat, far too fine for a town like Redemption. He dismounted in front of the saloon, his movements fluid and graceful like a dancer. He tied his horse to the hitching post, a sleek black stallion with eyes that seemed to gleam with an unnatural intelligence. The stranger's face was handsome, with sharp features and a charming smile. But there was something unsettling about his eyes, a coldness that didn't quite match the warmth of his smile. They were the eyes of a predator assessing his surroundings. He pushed open the saloon doors, the sound of piano music and boisterous laughter spilling out into the street. The room quieted as all eyes turned to him. He scanned the crowd, his gaze lingering on Clayton for a moment before moving on. "Evening, folks," he said, his voice smooth as honey. "Name, Sela's, just passing through." He walked to the bar and ordered a whiskey, tossing a silver dollar onto the counter. He told stories of far-off lands and daring adventures, captivating the townsfolk with his charm and wit. He spoke of bustling cities, treacherous deserts, and mountains that scraped the sky. Clayton watched him from a corner table, nursing a beer. He didn't trust Sila's. There was something about him that felt wrong, like a wolf in sheep's clothing. He noticed the way Silas's hand hovered near the pearl-handled revolver strapped to his hip. He seemed too quick, too alert for a simple traveler. He was out of place, like a splash of bright color on a canvas of muted tones. Clayton knew trouble had just walked into redemption. He only hoped he could stop it before it found his doorstep. The next few days were filled with a growing sense of unease in redemption. Silas continued to charm the townsfolk, but beneath the surface, tensions were rising. It started small, a shove in the saloon, a harsh word exchanged during a poker game, but the incidents grew more frequent and more violent. One evening, a bar fight erupted after Silas accused a local farmer of cheating at cards. Silas moved with lightning speed, his fist connecting with the farmer's jaw, sending him sprawling to the floor. The fight escalated quickly, chairs were overturned and punches were thrown. Clayton watched from the sidelines, his hand never far from his own weapon. He didn't want to get involved, but he knew Silas was the instigator. Another day, Silas got into an argument with the blacksmith over the price of shoeing his horse. The argument turned ugly, with Silas making veiled threats and the blacksmith standing his ground. Silas eventually paid the blacksmith's price, but the air hung heavy with unspoken hostility. These small acts of violence worried the townsfolk. They were used to settling disputes with words, not fists. Silas's presence was disrupting the peace they had worked so hard to maintain. Clayton saw the fear in their eyes, the way they avoided Silas whenever possible. He knew that something had to be done, but he wasn't sure what. He tried to talk to the sheriff, a kind but aging man named Johnson, but Johnson was hesitant to act without concrete evidence of wrongdoing. He didn't want to provoke Silas, fearing it would only make things worse. Clayton knew that waiting was not an option. He could feel the storm gathering on the horizon, and he knew that it would break soon. He just hoped they could weather it. He spent more time at home, keeping a close eye on Billy, making sure he stayed safe. He taught him how to shoot, telling him it was just for practice, but knowing in his heart that it might be for something more. The night of violence descended upon redemption like a black cloud. It started at the saloon. Whispers turned to shouts, cards were slammed on the table, and then gunshots ripped through the air. Silas, his face a mask of cold fury, stood over 3 fallen men, his silver coat stained crimson. Chaos erupted, people screamed and ran for cover. Sheriff Johnson, finally spurred into action, tried to intervene, but Silas was too quick. A shot rang out and Johnson fell, clutching his chest. Silas calmly reloaded his revolver, his eyes scanning the room for his next target. Clayton, hearing the commotion, grabbed his rifle and ran towards the saloon. He arrived to find the street deserted, save for the bodies lying in the dust. The saloon doors swung open, revealing Silas silhouetted against the flickering lamplight. "Clayton," Silas said, his voice laced with mockery, "I was wondering when you'd show up." Before Clayton could react, Silas fired. The bullet whizzed past Clayton's head, narrowly missing him. He ducked behind a water trough, returning fire. The gunfight was short and brutal. Silas, an expert marksman, seemed to anticipate Clayton's every move. Knowing he was outgunned, Clayton retreated towards his ranch, hoping to draw Silas away from the town. But Silas was relentless, pursuing him with a chilling determination. As Clayton reached his ranch, he saw flames licking at the barn, the sky illuminated by the inferno. He heard Billy scream. Silas had already been there. He found Billy lying on the ground, clutching his leg, a pool of blood spreading around him. Rage surged through Clayton, blinding him. He charged towards Silas, who was standing by the burning barn, a satisfied smirk on his face. Another shot rang out, and Clayton felt a searing pain in his shoulder. He stumbled, but he didn't fall. He wouldn't let Silas win, not while Billy was still alive. The night was filled with fire, screams, and the acrid smell of burning wood and gunpowder. Redemption was no longer redeemed. It was consumed. The sight of Billy, pale and bleeding, snapped something within Clayton. The years of peace, the vow he'd made to never raise a hand in anger again, all crumbled to dust. He was no longer Clayton Graves, the rancher. He was something else entirely, something darker. He carried Billy into the remains of their house, the walls still smoldering. He ripped a piece of cloth from a blanket and tied it tightly around Billy's leg, stemming the flow of blood. "You'll be all right, son," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I promise you, you'll be all right." He knew he couldn't stay, Silas would be back. He needed to get Billy to safety, and then he needed to hunt Silas down. He sent a neighbor who had miraculously survived the night to fetch Doc Miller from the next town over. He told him to bring back medicine and to keep Billy safe until he returned. Then, Clayton turned his attention to the task at hand. He retrieved his old gun belt from a hidden compartment under the floorboards. The leather was cracked and worn, but the gun felt familiar in his hand like an old friend. He cleaned and oiled it, his movements precise and practiced. He gathered supplies, ammunition, a canteen of water, a bedroll, and a few pieces of dried meat. He rummaged through the wreckage of the barn, finding Samson miraculously unharmed. He saddled the horse, his face grim. As he rode away from the burning ranch, he looked back one last time. The flames cast long, dancing shadows across the landscape, a testament to the destruction Silas had wrought. He clenched his jaw, his eyes burning with a cold, unwavering determination. He was no longer a builder. He was a hunter, and Silas was his prey. He rode into the darkness, leaving behind the ashes of his past and embracing a future stained with vengeance. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as Clayton followed Silas's trail. The landscape was unforgiving, a vast expanse of sun-baked earth dotted with thorny bushes and jagged rocks. The air shimmered with heat, making it difficult to see. Silas had a good head start, but he wasn't trying to hide his tracks. He seemed to be taunting Clayton, daring him to follow. The trail led south towards the Devil's Spine, a treacherous mountain range known for its hidden canyons and deadly wildlife. Clayton pressed on, his body aching, his throat parched. He rationed his water carefully, knowing that the next water source could be days away. The sun turned the earth to a furnace. He shielded his eyes, scanning the horizon for any sign of Silas. He encountered vultures circling overhead, a grim reminder of the fate that awaited him if he faltered. He passed abandoned homesteads, their windows dark and empty, their stories lost to the wind. These were the ruins of dreams, just like his own. The terrain grew increasingly difficult. He navigated narrow canyons, climbed steep cliffs, and crossed dry riverbeds. Samson, though strong and sure-footed, struggled in the heat. Clayton dismounted frequently, leading the horse on foot, giving him a chance to rest. He faced other challenges as well. Rattlesnakes slithered across his path, scorpions lurked beneath rocks, and the threat of bandits was ever present. He had to be constantly vigilant, his senses on high alert. One evening a sandstorm blew in, blinding him and threatening to bury him alive. He took shelter in a small cave, huddled against the wind and sand, waiting for the storm to pass. He thought of Billy, his face etched with pain, and the image fueled his determination. He would not give up. He would not rest until he found Silas and made him pay for what he had done. The desert was a harsh mistress, but Clayton was tougher. He would survive. He had to. As Clayton rode, the memories came flooding back, unbidden and unwelcome. He saw himself as a young man, barely more than a boy, his face hardened by years of violence. He remembered the sting of gunpowder, the taste of blood, the cold emptiness that followed each kill. He had been a gunslinger, a hired gun, drifting from town to town, selling his skills to the highest bidder. He was fast, ruthless, and feared by many. He had earned a reputation as a killer, a man who left a trail of bodies in his wake. But the violence had taken its toll. He saw the faces of his victims in his dreams, their eyes filled with fear and accusation. He felt the weight of their deaths on his soul, a burden that grew heavier with each passing year. The turning point came when he accidentally shot and killed a young woman during a bank robbery gone wrong. He hadn't meant to kill her, but the bullet had found its mark, and her life had been extinguished in an instant. He looked into her eyes as she lay dying, and he saw the reflection of his own darkness. He realized that he had become the very thing he despised, a monster. He vowed then and there to change his ways. He threw down his guns, walked away from the life of violence, and sought redemption. He found it in Martha, a kind and gentle woman who saw the good in him, even when he couldn't see it himself. She helped him build a new life, a life of peace and purpose. They settled down on the ranch, raised Billy, and created a haven from the storm. He swore he would never pick up a gun again, that he would protect his family with his bare hands if necessary. But Silas had shattered that vow. He had forced Clayton to confront his past, to embrace the darkness he had tried so hard to leave behind. Now he was riding towards a future he had desperately tried to avoid, a future filled with violence and death. He closed his eyes, a single tear. The trail Silas left was easy enough to follow, but it wasn't a straight line. It meandered through small settlements and isolated farms, each encounter painting a clearer picture of the man Clayton was hunting. In a dusty town called Harmony, he found a widow whose husband had been swindled out of his life savings by a smooth-talking stranger in a silver coat. The description matched Sela's perfectly. The widow's eyes were filled with a quiet despair that mirrored Clayton's own grief. Her story fueled his resolve, reminding him of the innocent lives Sela's had destroyed. Further down the trail, he met a group of traveling merchants who had been robbed by a man fitting Sela's description. They had been left stranded in the desert without food or water. They spoke of Sela's cruelty, his cold indifference to their suffering. Their anger became Clayton's anger. He found a burned-out farmhouse, the remnants of a family's dreams reduced to ashes. The neighbors told him that a stranger in a silver coat had come through, demanding supplies and threatening violence. When the family refused, he had set the house ablaze, leaving them to fend for themselves. The senseless act of violence solidified Clayton's determination to stop Sela's, no matter the cost. Each encounter chipped away at Clayton's remaining reservations, hardening his heart and sharpening his focus. He saw the fear and pain Sela's had inflicted on others, and he knew that he couldn't allow him to continue his reign of terror. He was no longer just seeking revenge for Billy and his lost ranch. He was fighting for all those who had been victimized by Sela's, for the hope of a future where such evil could not thrive. The stories of suffering he encountered served as a constant reminder of what was at stake, pushing him forward even when his body screamed for rest. Sela's had left a trail of tears, and Clayton was determined to bring that trail to an end. As Clayton pieced together Sela's path of destruction, he began to wonder what drove the man. It wasn't just random violence. There was a pattern, a purpose hidden beneath the chaos. Was Sela's simply evil, a force of nature driven by nothing more than a desire to inflict pain, or was there something more to it? In a deserted trading post, Clayton found a discarded wanted poster, crumpled and faded. It depicted a man who bore a striking resemblance to Sela's, though the name listed was different: Reuben Thorne, wanted for murder and robbery. The poster mentioned a wealthy businessman named Harrison, suggesting Thorne might be seeking revenge for a past wrong. But revenge didn't quite fit. Sela's seemed to enjoy the suffering he caused, taking pleasure in the fear and despair of his victims. It was more than just settling a score. Clayton also noticed that Sela's seemed to be avoiding large towns and cities, sticking to remote settlements and isolated farms. Was he running from something or someone? Was he trying to disappear to create a new identity? He overheard snippets of conversations in saloons and trading posts, whispers of a powerful organization that Sela's had crossed, a group that would stop at nothing to silence him. Some said Sela's had stolen something valuable, others claimed he had betrayed their trust. Clayton couldn't be sure which theory was true. Perhaps Sela's was a pawn in a larger game, a man driven by greed, revenge, or fear. Or perhaps he was simply a monster, a soulless killer who reveled in chaos and destruction. Whatever his motivation, Clayton knew one thing for sure: Sela's had to be stopped. He was a danger to everyone he encountered, and the only way to ensure the safety of the innocent was to bring him to justice, one way or another. He tightened his grip on the reins, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The truth was out there, waiting to be discovered, and Clayton would find it even if it cost him his life. As Clayton neared the Devil's Spine, the landscape became even more treacherous. He knew Sela's was close. He could feel it in the air, a sense of impending danger that prickled his skin. Rounding a bend in a narrow canyon, he was ambushed. 3 men, their faces hidden behind bandanas, emerged from the rocks, their guns drawn. They were rough-looking characters, clearly hired guns. "Sela's sends his regards," one of them sneered. "He said to tell you to turn around and go home. This ain't your fight." Clayton knew they wouldn't let him pass. This was a test, a way for Sela's to gauge his strength and determination. He dismounted Samson, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "I'm not turning around," Clayton said, his voice low and steady. "Tell Sela's I'm coming for him." The gunfight was fast and furious. The canyon echoed with the sound of gunfire. Clayton moved with a speed and precision that belied his age. He shot one man in the chest, sending him sprawling to the ground. The other 2 scattered for cover, firing wildly. Clayton ducked behind a boulder, returning fire. He managed to wound one of the remaining gunmen in the leg, but not before taking a bullet himself. The bullet grazed his arm, leaving a burning sensation. He knew he couldn't stay pinned down. He charged out from behind the boulder, firing his revolver. He shot the wounded gunman, then turned his attention to the last remaining enemy. The final gunman was younger and faster than Clayton, but Clayton had experience on his side. He anticipated the gunman's moves, dodging his shots and returning fire with deadly accuracy. The gunman fell, clutching his stomach. Clayton stood over the fallen men, his chest heaving, his body aching. He had won, but the victory had come at a cost. The bullet wound in his arm throbbed, and he felt a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. He proved that he was still a capable fighter, but the fight had taken a toll. He bandaged his arm, knowing that he couldn't afford to slow down. Silas was waiting. Clayton found Silas in a desolate ghost town nestled deep within the Devil's Spine. The town was a collection of crumbling buildings and weathered tombstones, a testament to dreams that had died long ago. Dust devils danced through the empty streets, and the wind howled like a mournful spirit. The setting mirrored the emptiness and despair that both men carried within them. Clayton had lost everything: his family, his home, his peace of mind. Silas, whatever his motivations, was clearly a man haunted by his own demons. Silas stood in the center of the town square, his silver coat gleaming in the harsh sunlight. He seemed to be waiting for Clayton, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. "I knew you'd come," Silas said, his voice echoing through the deserted town. "I always knew you were the kind of man who couldn't let things go." Clayton dismounted Samson, his movements slow and deliberate. He could feel the weight of his gun in his hand, the weight of his past, the weight of his grief. "Why?" Clayton asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you do it?" Silas shrugged. "Does it matter? You were in my way, you had something I wanted." "What did I have that you wanted?" Clayton asked. "Peace," Silas replied, a hint of sadness in his voice. "Something I can never have." Clayton knew that words were useless. There was no reasoning with a man like Silas, no reaching the humanity that might have once existed within him. All that was left was violence, a final reckoning between two men who had been brought together by fate and circumstance. He drew his revolver, the sound echoing through the silent town. Silas mirrored his action, his own gun appearing in his hand with lightning speed. The final confrontation had begun. The desolate setting reflected the emptiness and pain within both men. There was no escape, only a final showdown. The air crackled with tension as Clayton and Silas faced each other, guns drawn. The silence was broken only by the howling wind, a mournful soundtrack to the impending violence. Silas fired first, the bullet whizzing past Clayton's ear. Clayton dove for cover behind a crumbling stone wall, returning fire. The gunfight was a blur of motion and sound, a deadly dance between two men with nothing left to lose. Clayton moved with a speed and agility that surprised even himself. He remembered the lessons he had learned as a young gunslinger, the instincts that had been buried for so long. But he wasn't fighting for revenge, not anymore. He was fighting for Billy, for the chance to rebuild their lives, for the hope of a future free from fear. He saw an opening and took it, firing his revolver. The bullet struck Silas in the shoulder, but the stranger didn't flinch. He simply smiled, a cold and menacing expression that sent a chill down Clayton's spine. Silas returned fire, forcing Clayton to take cover again. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever. He was older, slower, and wounded. He needed to find a way to end this quickly. He thought of Billy lying injured in the care of Doc Miller. He pictured his son's face, his eyes filled with hope and trust. That image gave him strength, renewed his determination. He burst from behind the wall, firing his revolver. He emptied the chamber, the bullets finding their mark. Silas staggered, his silver coat now stained with blood. But Silas wasn't finished. He raised his own gun, aiming at Clayton's heart. Clayton knew this was it, the end of the line. He closed his eyes, bracing for the impact, but the shot never came. He opened his eyes to see Silas collapsing to the ground, a look of surprise on his face. Clayton had won, he had survived, but the victory felt hollow, tainted by the violence and loss that had brought him to this point. He wasn't fighting for revenge, he was fighting for what remained. Clayton stared down at Silas's lifeless body, the silver coat now a tarnished gray in the dust. The wind whipped around him, carrying the scent of gunpowder and death. He had won, but the victory felt empty, a hollow echo in the desolate landscape. His body ached, his wounded arm throbbed, and his heart was heavy with grief and regret. He had become the very thing he had sworn to never be again, a killer. He had traded his peace for vengeance, and the cost had been immense. he knew he would never be the same. The images of the violence he had witnessed and inflicted would forever be etched into his mind. The weight of those memories would be a constant companion, a shadow that would follow him for the rest of his days. He was wounded not just physically but emotionally. He had lost his home, his wife, his peace of mind. He had been forced to confront his past, to embrace the darkness he had tried so hard to bury. He knelt beside Silas's body, closing the stranger's eyes. He didn't feel pity or remorse, only a deep sense of sadness. Silas had been a broken man, a victim of his own demons. He had sought peace in all the wrong places, and in the end he had found only death. Clayton knew that Silas's death wouldn't bring back Martha, wouldn't rebuild his ranch, wouldn't erase the pain in Billy's eyes, but it would bring an end to the violence, a closure to the chapter of destruction that Silas had unleashed. He stood up, his body stiff and sore. He had a long journey ahead of him, a journey back to Billy, back to the remnants of his life. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he had to keep moving forward to rebuild, to heal, to find a way to live with the scars of the past. He turned his horse around and rode away from the ghost town, leaving Silas behind in the dust. He carried the weight of his wounds, both seen and unseen, but he also carried a glimmer of hope, a flicker of determination to create a better future for himself and his son. He had defeated the stranger, but the battle within him was far from over. Clayton returned to what was left of his ranch. The sight of the charred remains a painful reminder of all he had lost. The house was a skeleton of its former self, the barn a pile of ashes, but amidst the devastation there was life. He found Billy, pale but alive, sitting on the porch of a neighbor's house. Doc Miller had done what he could, and Billy was on the mend. The sight of his son filled Clayton with a surge of relief and gratitude. "Pa," Billy cried, running to embrace him. "You came back." Clayton held his son tight, burying his face in his hair. "I told you I would," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The road ahead would be long and difficult. They would have to rebuild their home, replant their fields, and find a way to heal from the trauma they had endured. But they would do it together. The townsfolk of Redemption, those who had survived, rallied around them, offering food, shelter, and support. They had seen the darkness that Silas had brought, but they had also witnessed the strength and resilience of Clayton and Billy. Clayton knew that he couldn't erase the past, but he could build a better future. He would teach Billy the values of hard work, honesty, and compassion. He would show him that even in the face of loss, there was always hope. They started small, clearing the rubble, salvaging what they could. They built a temporary shelter, a place to call home. They planted a small garden, a symbol of new beginnings. Clayton knew that he would never truly be at peace. The scars of the past would always be with him, but he also knew that he had something worth fighting for, something worth living for. He had Billy. As the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, Clayton stood beside his son, surveying their land. It was a ruin, but it was also a blank canvas, a place where they could rebuild their lives, brick by brick, dream by dream. The future was uncertain, but they faced it together, with hope in their hearts and determination in their eyes. They would rebuild not just their ranch, but their lives. And from the ruins, something new and beautiful would grow.